Eric Schmidt is joining us from Google, and he will be interviewed by Gwen Ifill of PBS. Gwen? Hello. Hello. Come on in. Nice to see you, Gabe. No.
See you. Nice to see you, Margaret. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We are here with the executive chairman of Google, and I have far more questions than time will allow, so I'm going to plunge right in.
You can always look up in Google and get the answer.
Ha ha ha. Last week you were here in Washington. You were testifying before a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee. How was it being hauled before Congress and basically being told that you had cooked your search results?
Well, we of course said we had not. I assure you we have not cooked anything, was my response. I think in many ways it's been good, at least so far, because it's made the company more clearly articulate how we make our decisions, in particular publicly describe that, which is to focus on consumers. So far I think it's overall been positive. And I should say, by the way, that the government has a role here. You know, this is their job to do, and so we have to respect that.
Well, let's talk about the government's role, because a lot of the members of Congress who were grilling you last week made it clear that on some level, this Democrats and Republicans, that Google scares them. Why shouldn't it?
Well, our answer, which I said at the time, was that we make decisions algorithmically. We literally believe in the power of the algorithm and ranking and so forth. And we make decisions based on what our testing indicates consumers want in terms of a global search engine. I do understand that Google ranks information and there's winners and losers, and those decisions have significant impact on people. So the word scares is their word, not mine. On the other hand, we provide a free and important service to an awful lot of people, and we take great pride in doing it right.
Questions about search dominance, questions about copyright, questions about privacy. How do you begin to tackle all of those when you are now obviously the subject of a Federal Trade Commission investigation?
Well, so far our answer has been that the principles that we founded the company on seem to be working. And broad and open access to information, try to be as transparent as possible, all the kinds of things that we've said over and over again. On privacy, we've taken a pretty strong position that privacy is important, that you should have as much control over privacy as possible. And again, we also understand that an awful lot of data is being collected about you. So in each of those cases, I think my personal reaction was that this is the right thing for an antitrust committee to be doing. They should be asking these questions. But it's also important to remember that there haven't been any accusations about Google from either the Europeans or the FTC yet. This is the beginning of listening, if you will. And so I think we should reserve judgment until we actually hear if there's any alleged violations of any of the rules.
It's the beginning of listening. Do you get the sense that you're being heard?
Well, I can tell you that with the regulators, we absolutely are. What happens is the regulators are very thorough, basically give you either voluntarily or if you don't like them, they'll give you involuntary subpoenas. So we ship them enormous amounts of data about how we make decisions, what we did in this case, what we did in that case. In the European Commission, they sent some number of hundreds of letters to other people asking them and so forth. The process takes a pretty long time. I think it's going to be a while before we're going to hear back.
There's the political process, there's the regulatory process. Which do you like least or best?
Well, so far the political process has not been particularly, aside from a hearing, there's not been very much. The regulatory process, I think we should reserve judgment, and I mean that honestly. From our perspective, we've always understood the role that we took, and way back when the company was small, we sort of wrote the equivalent of a memo saying, how can you be big without being evil, right? And we've adopted what we think are those principles. So for example, if you're a consumer and you don't like our service, we make it very easy for you to take the data from Google and take it to a competitor. Other people don't do that. That's examples.
So it's easy if you are doing a search on Google to decide, I don't like this search result. It's likely that a consumer would then say, I'll just go and search it up on Bing? Is there a...
Well, the other primary competitor is Bing. We're also seeing quite a bit of competition now emerging in vertical applications. Look at the rise of Twitter and Facebook and even more specialized searches on mobile devices. So my guess is that the market expands in terms of competitors in that way, and that the two primary general purpose competitors will be Google and Microsoft for a pretty long time.
You made a comment at your Zeitgeist conference about Microsoft in which you said, you actually described them as someone who used to be your competitor. Was that a joke? Was that real?
Well, I was actually referring to it in a different context. If you look at the next 5 to 10 years, there's a set of companies which are establishing whole new platforms on the internet. They're sort of driving the discussion forward, and I named them, by the way, as Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. And the question was, why did you not mention Microsoft? And I don't see them playing that role. That was not a comment about search. In search, there's no question that Bing is our primary competitor.
I noticed you had a Mac Air on the table in front of you at the hearing last week. Why not one of your own products?
Well, partly because the Mac Air has everything I needed in case somebody asked me a question. Because I figured you might as well answer a question with data.
Okay. Let's go back to the question about regulation. We are in the middle of that big discussion here now in Washington, in which it's basically split on party lines. Republicans say that this administration is too interested in regulation and is regulating business out of business. And the Democrats are more likely to be in favor of the idea of increased regulation. You're famously a supporter of this president, of this administration. Where do you come down on that?
The people who are in favor of regulation are only in favor of regulation to the degree that it's the correct regulation. And I think that's where the rub is. If you look, there are many markets where additional regulation would have saved us, for example, from the financial crisis. And in some cases, regulations can promote new industries like the green tech industries, which are to some degree the future of American energy independence and so forth, which everybody here knows. So I think it's in that context that people tend to support it. Regulations that are, cronyism or, whatever, or serve to preserve specific incumbencies are obviously not what people are in favor of. My guess is that that these are sound bites that are really long paragraphs, and that what happens in the debate is they get compressed into it. And if you actually sat down and you said, there's general support, for example, of raising the CAFE standards, because one of the quickest ways to improve our energy independence is to raise automobile efficiency, which can be done over a period of time in a rational way.
It sounds like you're saying there's actually much more agreement in Washington that is visible to our naked eyes.
Well, my perception, I'm not sure about Washington, but my perception is that there's a much more optimistic view of how America should proceed, which goes something like some reasonable consensus around, or at least some kind of compromise on some of the longer-term structural issues in the economy, and then in the short term, some reasonably short-term specific stimulus issues, for example, around building out infrastructure and so forth, which benefits all of us, and we'll use it anyway to create new jobs.
There actually isn't agreement about infrastructure.
Well, the people that I talk with, when you actually ask, are you in favor of, for example, putting the laid-off construction workers back in work to try to sort of help build roads, most people that I talk with say that they are.
Who are you talking with?
The people that I talk with, that's right. And if the answer is no, then so be it. But from a country perspective, the country will be better off if we can forge a path through this. There's lots and lots of reasons to be optimistic about America. You don't hear them here. If you look at the rate of new industries that are being created, the new technologies that are possible, the things that science and technology all invented here in America can do, that story is not being told, and I think it needs to be talked about.
Well, one of the reasons I'm pressing you about the debate here in Washington is because I don't think, from what I read and the people I talk to who are outside of Washington, that it is generally agreed upon that there is any area of agreement on anything that, like what you're describing.
Well, let's say that there isn't. We still have to do something, right? We have to come to some kind of an agreement.
As a businessman, what agreement do you see is gettable?
What business would like, business as a general rule wants predictability. So for example, this flirtation with the debt issue was not a good scenario. It just makes everybody nervous, and people have enough problems in running their business. So anything that we can do to provide predictable outcomes from the way government programs work, predictable government spending. We're in a situation where continuing resolutions are now allowing us another week or another 2 weeks of government spending. That's not good for business, and it's not good for America. So I think that if the government can sort of organize itself with a slightly longer term perspective, that would be very helpful. With respect to specific programs, it's clear to me that you need to simultaneously solve some agreement around the long-term structural issues, which are horrific. Look at the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and something in the short term which helps create additional demand. That demand will come from additional government spending and or targeted government programs.
You know, there has been a discussion going on here for some time about whether tech industries get Washington or Washington gets the tech industry. It took Microsoft a while to realize it, and Bill Gates was hauled before a committee here, not maybe a dozen years ago. Now Google is here. The word is that you resisted the idea of coming here to actually testify. How important is Washington to Google or to the tech industry and vice versa?
Well, Washington is the government, and therefore they can screw us up. So that's the simple starting point. And historically, the high-tech industry has largely ignored Washington. And in the last 10 years after Microsoft's experience, I think everybody sort of figured out that it was important to have representatives here and so forth. Most of the tech companies, including Google, have tried to stay in the lobbying for ideas phase as opposed to lobbying for specific sentences written in specific bills. And that seems more palatable to the way we all operate. And most of the tech companies agree, for example, with the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Most tech companies agree with the importance of broadband, policies that accelerate broadband, help America, things like accelerated R&D tax credit and those sorts of things. These are all export businesses. They're all growing.
Caught my ear that Washington can screw you up. How?
Well, there are situations where the unintended consequences of laws. A classic example is in 1996, the Telecom Act had a provision that would have eliminated what is known as caching in the way the data is stored. It would have broken the way routers worked, and so we changed that. So every once in a while, people write a law which has this sort of bizarre unintended effect. What we ask is if the government needs to regulate something, regulate the outcome, not the technology that gets you there. So if you regulate the behavior, not the underlying technology, because the technology moves so quickly. And why would we want that? Well, technology industry has contributed about 15% of GDP growth in the last 5 years. We have an outsized contribution in terms of both growth and profits to the country. So I think it's worth us continuing to do very well.
When you took over at Google 10 years ago, you said that you came in because Google needed adult day-to-day supervision. You're a Washington native. You're obviously spending a lot of time here now, speaking to a lot of very important people. Does Washington need adult day-to-day supervision?
I think the sooner we can turn Washington over to the next younger generation of bright young people coming out of colleges and universities with the kind of hope that I deal with and that I work with, the better. This next generation understands the social compact better than my generation ever did. They're smarter in many ways. They have a more global perspective. So I take the opposite side with respect to leadership.
What could be fixed here first, do you think? Is it leadership?
Well,
is it?
No, I actually think it's a math problem. The problem that we largely have, I think, is a result of redistricting. And I think that there should be a constitutional amendment that would just require them to be parallelograms, basically just straight lines. It would solve all the problems.
The engineer's response?
It would work. And it would, by the way, it really would.
You've said that business can create jobs if consumer demand comes back. That's our basic problem here. Does government have a role in that?
Well, government has a huge contribution to the economic situation in America, and everybody understands this. Government is both a standard setter in terms of purchasing as well as a regulator and so forth. It's very important to understand that we're stuck at the moment. We're growing at 1% to 2% in terms of economic growth. That growth is not enough to overcome the natural improvements in business productivity that are occurring without additional jobs. So if you're a business person, what happens is you sit there and you say, well, my business is growing a couple percent, but I'm getting that out of IT improvements and process improvements and manufacturing improvements and occasionally offshoring. So I don't need to hire more people. So as a national, in my view, it's sort of a national emergency that we need to get the growth of the country as measured by GDP or something like that growing faster. That's something which we all participate in. The jobs are created by the private sector. The wealth is created by the private sector. We've proven as a country that we can create enormous numbers of such companies and wealth and people and so forth. It's been the mainstay of post-war the United States. So we need to have that conversation. And instead, the conversation is about an awful lot of other things. That's the central issue. How do we get our growth rate to 3 to 4 to 5%? It should be possible. There are lots of examples. Rebuilding America's energy infrastructure. You want to take all of these unemployed construction workers who cannot find jobs because their previous jobs were basically manufactured out of the credit bubble, hire them to insulate federal buildings. Right? Pick some category like that. There are new industries around material science that could revolutionize manufacturing in America with American engineers. There are all sorts of new synthetic foods, all sorts of other science around that are being invented here that over the next 10 years could provide very large global industries. We need to focus more on those. That's where the growth will come from.
But when the administration says in its jobs bill that it would actually like to increase taxes on the wealthiest, is that a job-destroying proposition, as Republicans argue?
Looking at the math, that particular component does not matter very much in my argument, and I'm not going to make a political argument, I'll make a policy argument. That number is a relatively small number compared to the overall tax policy issues across the other 98% and so forth. That's more of a justice and a political question than an incentive question.
Would you like to?
In other words, it doesn't matter. It does not matter compared to the other things we're talking about as much.
Would you like to see your taxes raised?
In my case, it's not a particularly big issue because it wouldn't change my behavior, but for other people it might. But on a personal, but my personal view of that is not very important. What is important is how do we get the productive parts of America working harder with greater exports, with more investment in the things that will grow the economy. That's the only conversation that matters. Everything else solves itself with growth. Simple rule as a CEO, revenue solves all problems. It's true of countries as well. If you're in China and you're growing at 8 to 10%, Turkey growing at 10%, these guys, they have problems. They don't have real problems. Real problems is when you're not growing, or if you're in some of the countries in Europe where you have negative GDP growth. It's extraordinarily difficult to go back to people and take all that stuff away.
Where there is growth right now in the business economy, it is in the tech sector. How do we know we're not in another tech bubble?
Well, the growth that I'm talking about is real revenue growth. The bubble is typically a term for the valuations in the stock market. The curious thing about the tech companies is they typically are not reliant on credit markets at all. So it sort of doesn't really matter what their stock price is. What really matters is what their revenue growth is. And part of the reason that you see such very high valuations in technology is because there's an assumption that when these things grow, they'll grow very dramatically because of the scale and size of the internet. And there's some evidence that that's true. These could become massive American businesses. So let's reward them with optimism.
If there is going to be growth, it seems that it's in social media. And Google's playing on that field as well. Does social media have the potential of completely transforming the way we communicate?
Well, in many ways it already has. One of the questions is, what are we going to do as a society with all those 16-year-olds posts when all those people are 36? It's pretty clear to me there's going to be a law which says you can't discriminate against people based on their pictures below age 18. There'll be additional sort of civil rights sort of acts around teenagers.
One can only hope.
Well, there's going to have to be based on my personal inspection. So we already know it's transforming it. And we know that if you look at Facebook, which I think is arguably now the most successful of the online sites in that regard, look at the level of activity. It's really extraordinary how much time people are spending on those.
Did you miss the boat as CEO at Google on the social media explosion?
We were late to this. We were focused on other things. And you sit down as CEO and you say, like, why didn't we focus more on that? Well, we were busy on this, which did really well. And so now we have a product called Google+, which is doing extremely well, which looks like a worthwhile competitor in a slightly different space with more privacy controls, for example, than Facebook.
So you can beat Facebook at its own game?
It's very hard to beat a fast-moving incumbent in exactly the same game in technology because it changes so quickly. What you have to do is you have to find a new problem and do that much better than they are, and that's what we're trying to do. And if you do that, you can ultimately, win very large.
I'm on Twitter. I try to be up on all the stuff the kids are talking about. But I wonder the degree to which social media enhances what we already believe, and even searches, rather than expanding the conversation.
Well, that question has been raised for the last 100 years about communications technology. And I've learned to not have an opinion on how people choose to spend their time. We just want to have them spend more time on Google doing it. So it's pretty simple. I mean, we're not going to make a decision as to whether this is a good use of people's time or not. It's always alarming to me that people text message. They don't talk on the phone anymore. And people actually forgotten how to leave voice messages on phone. So it's sort of shocking, right?
They've forgotten how to check them as well.
That's right. So you know, this is sort of the norm of how society moves forward. What I will tell you,
is that good?
I would say overall, this is extraordinarily good. And I want to push back very hard on sort of the critics of this and say, look, you were worried about where your teenager is. Now we know where they are. They're in their room online. It's a much safer place than a lot of other places your teenager can be. Point one.
Well, there are those who would argue that point, but okay.
Lock the door. Trust me. You know, we at least know where they are. The second point I would make about it is that communication is what humans do. And the sense of community, the sense of reach, the sense of wonder that you can build out of these online communities is really very nice. In terms of discovery and knowing things and so forth, we at Google can use that information with your permission and on an opt-in basis, I might add, to give you much better recommendations. So for example, if you tell us who your friends are, we can give you better YouTube recommendations.
But if we tell you who our friends are, you can give it away.
We choose not to, and we state that we won't. And that's in our privacy policy. And you should inform yourself when you give that sort of information to any company, what are they going to do with it?
The cloud. Is that going to also transform? Is that a whole new way? Are we going to throw away our desktops and our PCs?
Well, what will happen, the simplest answer is I'm sure everybody here has had a situation where they've either dropped their computer or it's broken and it had something important on it. What the cloud does is it basically keeps that information on servers run by somebody else, Google or one of our competitors, on fast networks. And then software over the last few years has been developed that brings software down to your computer like the program you used to install. For me, it's remarkable. I use Google Docs, which is our word processing software. I basically don't have to use Microsoft's product anymore, which is always good from my perspective. And it's really convenient. You know, Jared and I are writing a book together. We sit there next to each other, typing away on the text, right, on a cloud server, which is perhaps in another country. It's just, to me, it's just the most remarkable thing. Cloud computing is in many ways a business efficiency benefit. Like every company, including all of our competitors, are moving to it. And it also allows you to do things. A classic example would be Amazon. If you imagine Amazon without the cloud, then Amazon would keep your local sales history on your Mac or PC, but it wouldn't be able to give you recommendations because it wouldn't be able to look through the data and give you anonymized recommendations of what everyone else bought. Right? So by properly building cloud services, you can get the benefit of the crowd. Now they have to be anonymous and not violate your privacy and things like that, which Amazon does correctly.
This is the final question, but of course I have to ask you about politics. You were an Obama supporter. You're still an Obama supporter. Who would you say is his most formidable potential opposition? Or is he running against himself?
Well, incumbents like companies are always running against themselves. I think that's always the first answer. Because once you get into a certain position of power, and you have sort of the tools to play with, you really do have control over your own destiny to some degree. Now, in Washington, it's a little harder because you don't control the Congress, but you certainly have the opportunity to lead them. And I think the consensus among my Republican friends is that Romney will be the most likely candidate, and the governor is somebody who I've known well and has been an able governor.
So how do you beat him?
Well, I'm not running the campaign.
But if they were to ask?
I think presidents run on their records, and they run on the things that they've done and the things that they're going to do. And if you will, the electorate has to sort of decide. This president, I say as a supporter, inherited the world's worst configuration. It's impossible to imagine what these guys inherited, and I think they've done well.
And when in doubt as a voter, you can just Google the information,
That's
right?
It.
Eric Schmidt, thank you very much.
Sure.